Games, like everything, are defined by their legacy. There's no need for perfection, but to be remembered, one must leave a mark, something that sticks in the minds and thoughts of those who experienced it. Some games accomplish this for the right reasons, and some for the wrong reasons. All a developer can do is hope that they leave one such mark. A mark like the one left by the Order 1886. And I know what you're thinking, that the Order 1886 was largely criticized at launch and many were told by gaming press that it wasn't worth their time, but I'm here to change your mind, at least a little. This game was way ahead of its time, and had it released just a few years later, it could have achieved so much more. Furthermore, I'll show you how, thanks to a concerted effort by some acting in bad faith, this game was dragged through the mud by so-called gaming journalists before it had even launched. To explain all of this, I'm going to split this discussion into the three phases of the game's life: its creation, its life, and its death. Be warned that I will be showing clips from all throughout the game, so if you're adverse to spoilers, proceed carefully. Timestamps will also be included below so you can jump to different chapters if you need to pick up and return to the video later. And as always, please like this video, and if you really enjoy it, subscribe and ring the bell. YouTube is really pushing down on gaming videos right now, so we can use any help we can get to get these videos into your sub boxes and recommended feed. And lastly, I want to say a big thank you to Squarespace for making this video possible. Squarespace is the website hosting and creation platform that's used by individuals and professionals alike. I've actually used Squarespace for years at this point to host my website, lukestevens.net, and the websites for my startup companies like rhapsodystream.com. I wasn't sponsored by them when I chose Squarespace to run my business's websites. Instead, I just went with the best option on the market, and that was and is Squarespace. So you know that I actually do believe in their quality and service because I use Squarespace every single day and have had stable, dynamic, and beautiful websites running perfectly for years. Check them out at squarespace.com/LukeStevens for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/LukeStevens to save 10% off of your first purchase of a website or domain. While we don't know much about the conception of the Order 1886, we do know some basic facts. For one, the game was originally conceptualized in 2010 after the success of Uncharted 2. Ru Weerasuriya, the game's creative director, said in interviews leading up to the game's release in 2015 that the success that Naughty Dog had found after the 2009 sensation that was Among Thieves inspired his studio, Ready at Dawn, to take a risk and try something new, something truly different. They were going to make a narrative game, one that focused on the story first and the gameplay second. It was going to be an interactive film in effect, and it was going to use the power of a new gaming system that didn't even exist yet. Prior to this, the team at Ready at Dawn had worked on God of War Chains of Olympus, Okami, and God of War Ghost of Sparta. They had created some phenomenal games, but they had never attempted anything like this new project before. It was going to be a real challenge and one hell of a risk, but that wasn't going to deter them. So the team began working. They first traveled to England from Irvine, California, where they were based, to begin researching. The team went all over London, capturing thousands upon thousands of photos and videos of everything from major landmarks to individual bricks and fences. They weren't certain what form their new game would take, but they knew they wanted it to be as authentic to the source material as possible. Upon returning to California, the team split into two main groups: those who were going to work on the tools and those who were going to do what's known as pre-production in the game development industry. And pre-production basically tasks the team with creating what's known as the game design document. And while the directors and designers were working on the concept, the rest of the team started outfitting their proprietary engine known as the Ready at Dawn Engine 4.0, or more simply, the RAD Engine 4. The toolset was reworked, and a special focus was placed on the materials engine specifically. A decision was also made to start the game's development with the most noticeable graphical feature, remarkably smaller than the industry average. You see, the Order 1886 uses a 2.4 to 1 aspect ratio instead of the standard 16.9 that had been so heavily advertised in the lead up to the PS4's launch. You see, 16:9 is the standard aspect ratio for full HD and even Ultra HD, and it's what's used in TV manufacturing and in many other display manufacturing processes such as computer monitors and laptops. This means that the 2.4 to 1 aspect ratio led to the game having large black bars on the top and bottom of the screen. It was done primarily to make the game look more cinematic, but it also helped the game achieve a graphical fidelity unlike anything the industry had seen to that point. You see, standard 1080p HD has 2,073,600 pixels to render. There are some techniques that developers will use, such as dynamic resolution scaling or checkerboarding, to get the resolution higher without actually having to render that, but for the sake of simplicity, it's roughly 2 million pixels that regular full HD is filled with. However, with the smaller aspect ratio, the Order 1886 only had to render about 1.5 million of those pixels, with the rest filling out those black bars. That means that the Order 1886 only had to render about 74% the amount of screen real estate that full HD did. As a result, that saved the team a lot of processing power by using this cinematic aspect ratio. And in addition to the wider frame looking more cinematic and more standard to what we would expect to see in Hollywood, it also enabled the team to push the graphical fidelity, post-processing, particle effects, everything to the max. Over the next few years, the team settled on the titular time period, the introduction of the Lycans as the main antagonist, and a steampunk, semi-historical art style that helped the game take on one of the most memorable artistic styles of the entire PS4 generation. The game was coming together, and Ready at Dawn were ready to show it off. So they took it to E3, and then they took it to press events and magazines and every other media publication under the sun. Soon, the game was covered by YouTubers and press alike, and the game shot into the public consciousness. The star that was the Order 1886 was burning bright and was set for launch on February 20th of 2015. But as we all know, the brightest stars burn out the fastest. In the days leading up to the game's launch, the reviews started rolling in. Media figures had set down their Valentine's Day cards and prepared for what they expected to be the best AAA $60 cinematic experience of the year. They cleared their calendars, prepped their G Fuel, and booted up their PS4s, and the response was mixed. While some review sites like Gaming Trends said, quote, "Literally no game has ever looked this good. The Order 1886 raises the bar so far above its contemporaries that it stands in a class all by itself. The Order 1886 is a cinematic masterpiece." But others had less nice things to say. Riot Pixels, which is apparently a gaming publication of some sort, said, quote, "You get 2 for 1 price, a boring movie and a poorly designed game." Digital Trends said, quote, "The Order 1886 is a terrible game." And GameSpot said, quote, "It is, at best, perfectly playable and lovely to look at and listen to. But it is also the face of mediocrity and missed opportunities. A bad game can make a case for itself. A boring one is harder to forgive." And I think that is the best encapsulation of the game itself. It was bland, sure. Played it too safe, absolutely, and failed to keep the gameplay experience on pace with the graphical one. All these critiques are certainly fair. This was a narrative, cinematic experience, not a gameplay one. And so the fact that much of the gameplay was lacking is far from surprising. There are larger issues too, such as the aspect ratio. While it had benefits, which we discussed earlier, there were also a lot of downsides. You see, the Order 1886 is a cover-based shooter, and the limited aspect ratio restricted the player's view so much that they could barely see what was going on behind the cover that they had to stay behind. The guns, while varied and fun to use, failed to really shine in the small shooting arenas that we were given. There were also a lot of quick-time events, which are just when players are prompted with X or triangle and they must press the corresponding button before they reach a fail state. These are often criticized for being a last-ditch effort by designers to have some level of interactability in a sequence when they can't think of anything else to do. If there's some big cutscene playing out, but we don't want the player to be bored, we'll just add in some button prompts so that they feel included. Basically, it's like giving your kid a controller that isn't connected so that they can feel as though they're doing something even though the game is going to play out the same exact way regardless. And while they are here and are the primary mode of interaction in cinematic moments, I don't actually think this criticism was or is fair. Some of the best games ever made have used QuickTime events. Spider-Man, The Last of Us Part 2, God of War 2018, and even Red Dead Redemption 2 all use QuickTime events, and those games weren't criticized at all for this. But in 2014 and 15, they were simply unacceptable. Say what you will about them, but they've grown more acceptable in recent years, likely thanks to the success of these aforementioned phenomenal games. However, if you know anything about the Order 1886, you know that the game was mostly mocked for its length. In fact, I even ran a poll on the channel, and you guys overwhelmingly voted that the game was bad primarily because of its length. Well, buckle up. I'm about to blow your mind, because that whole narrative is built on a coordinated hit piece that originated on 4chan and NeoGAF. You see, in the lead up to the game's launch, some individuals on these forums were upset that the game was highlighting its female cast in the marketing materials. They considered it to be yet another example of corporate wokeness going too far, and so a concerted effort was made to target the game and tear it down. The key way that they did this was with misinformation about the game. On February 16th, 4 days before the game's launch, a run-through of the game was posted to YouTube by a channel named Play Me Through, which no longer exists. And the video no longer exists either as a result of the channel's deletion, so I don't actually know what the posted run-through included or had removed. But what we do know for sure from some secondary sources is that the video presented the game as being 5 to 5.5 hours long. Soon after, hyperbole caused the game to be described as only 4 hours long in several major publications. And so, the deception was born. The crazy thing is, though, that I just played the game, and my run-through was over 9 hours long. Many others have played it and had their runs clock in between 6.5 to 8 hours or so, but the point is that the game is not 4 hours long, and it's not even 5 or 5.5 hours long. Now, to be fair, if you think that 6, 7, 8, or even 9 hours is still too short for a full $60 game, I can understand that. Absolutely. But the thing is that there are many games that are just as short and yet are praised and critically acclaimed in spite of it. Look at Resident Evil 8, a modern and very recent example. It's a game that clocks in at around 6.5 hours for the first run through. I'll have a link to the critique I did on the game in the description box below, and a card should be popping up right about now to link you to that so you can watch it after this video. We actually played the game on stream, so people saw I wasn't rushing the game or trying to speed run it. It was just short. I understand that many other people were able to get 10 or 12 hours out of their first run, but as far as I can tell, the game is simply short. And it doesn't do any good to pretend as though it's way longer than it actually is. But in spite of this, Resident Evil 8 was critically praised, even though it suffered from many of the exact same issues that the Order 1886 did. It was predictable, short, the gunplay was less than thrilling, and the $60 price tag was mighty steep for what the game had in terms of content. So what is the difference? Why was one game praised and one panned, one revered, one rejected? Why was one loved and one hated? You see, to put it very simply, I think that the excessive criticism levied against the Order 1886 can be explained away by looking at the time in which it released. This game came out at a time when EA, Activision, and even Valve were demonstrating just how greedy a corporation can get. Loot boxes, extensive DLC, microtransactions out the ass, all of it was at the forefront of everyone's minds and was a hotbed of discussion within the gaming community. Gaming personalities, journalists, and even streamers were all standing up and expressing their disdain for this shift. And thankfully, it worked in the long run. Over the next few years, a lot of companies were forced to reevaluate how they were doing things and restructure their approach to major releases and monetization. It took a couple of years and a couple of really bad flops, but the message eventually got across. However, the Order 1886 in many ways was the perfect example of what many people feared at the time. With the new gaming hardware becoming commonplace in people's households in the form of the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, we were seeing games come out with higher fidelity graphics that were often achieved at the cost of gameplay. Furthermore, games seemed to be getting a lot shorter, and the fear was that we would have to start paying a lot more for a lot less game. And to those looking to make a point, the Order 1886 was the perfect example of this market shift in action. It could be used to demonstrate why this was so bad and why gamers shouldn't allow publishers to get away with it. And so, through no fault of its own, the game began receiving extreme criticism from every corner of the industry for its QuickTime events, cinematic approach, setting, and some even became desperate enough to criticize it for an alleged glorification of colonial systems of government. I know, what does that have to do with anything? But there were people who were criticizing the game for it. I am not joking. To put it simply, I think that this game released at the wrong time. In a lot of ways, it was very ahead of its time. The engine, cinematics, and even the storytelling techniques were all used later in some of the greatest games of all time. The game was far from perfect, and I'm not going to pretend as though the shooting or cinematic aspect ratios made for a great gameplay experience. Those shortcomings were certainly a side effect of the game's ambition. They were trying so many new and novel things that some worked and some didn't. But to be fair, this is really common in new IPs. A lot of games will come along and try something different and stumble along the way. And we, as the consumers, just have to wait for the sequel to nail all of it and iron out all of the kinks. However, unfortunately, it looks as though Ready at Dawn will probably never get the chance. Ready at Dawn never really recovered from the reception of the Order 1886. Over the years following its launch, the team slowly disbanded, with many heading to Naughty Dog, Sony Santa Monica, and others to work on different projects. This is likely because those other studios saw the potential in the game and wanted access to the talent that had achieved it, but in doing so, they likely solidified the studio's fate. Left with not much else to do, Ready at Dawn's leadership decided that they would try to do something different, and so they developed Lone Echo for the Oculus Rift in 2017. And much to their credit, the game was actually met with a moderate amount of praise and good reviews, even sitting at an 89 on Metacritic. They would go on to release a few other titles in the same vein for the virtual reality platform until they were acquired in June of 2020 by Oculus Studios, which is owned by Facebook, to make VR games for the platform. It's not clear if Sony will ever try and resurrect the franchise, assigning it to a different studio, but what we do know is that Ready at Dawn will not be involved. There have been a few leaks of what people assume could be a sequel to the game, but nothing concrete has ever seen the light of day. And to be honest, I really don't know what studio would be capable of making a sequel to the Order 1886 that could live up to the vision set forth in the original game. Even today, the graphics achieved all the way back in 2015 in this game would be hard to pull off for anything less than a fantastically talented studio. The only studios working in the industry today with a hyper focus on graphical fidelity, cinematics, and grounded stories are already hard at work on their own franchises, and it would probably be a waste of time and an inordinate risk to assign them to a franchise which, by most accounts, did not commercially exceed the last time around. As sad as it makes me, as a fan of the original game, who really thinks that there was a lot of potential here, I think it's more likely than not that the Order 1886 continues to drift off into obscurity until it's eventually forgotten in the annals of gaming history. I would love to be proven wrong. And who knows, maybe you're watching this video at some point in the future after a sequel has been announced by some studio under Sony's wheelhouse, but for now, all we can do is appreciate this game for what it was and for the incredible thing that it did. It was a cinematic experience unlike anything else, and it was too far ahead of its time to be given the chance that it deserved. But in spite of that, it's still present in a lot of players' minds all these years later, including yours and mine. And I think for any game, that's pretty incredible.